Good evening, everybody. So good to see you this evening. Good to see everybody back able to be with us once again. We've got some visitors, and it's especially good to see you. Might be a good time to tell you that if you are visiting, I'm not the normal preacher. So that might give you some incentive to come back. Here's somebody that's better than me at some other time. We do hope you'll come back and visit us each and every opportunity you might have. We always strive to do things pleasing to God in accordance with God's Word here at O'Neill Church of Christ. And if you're visiting with us, if there's anything done that's not in accordance with God's Word, then you'll be our friend if you bring it to our attention. And I'll say that as well for the sermon this evening. I'm going to jump right in, and I want to begin our sermon with a story. The story we all know. We all know the story of the Exodus and the 10 plagues, right? That God sends Moses to Egypt and says, hey, the Israelites are in bondage there. They're being oppressed. And he sends Moses to Egypt to free his people. Moses goes down to Egypt and he tells Pharaoh, hey, let the Israelites go. Pharaoh says no. And God subsequently sends 10 plagues. 10 plagues upon Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Release them from bondage. At the end of that story, we have the 10th plague. 10th plague comes, it's the death of the firstborn. The Egyptians finally relent. Okay, we'll let the Israelites go. Egypt is in ruins. Its servant class is fleeing. The Israelites go through the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. They come to the Red Sea. And when they get to the Red Sea, the Egyptian army is hot on their heels. The army of the most powerful nation in the known world is coming down on a vast multitude of slaves, the Israelites. And the Israelites are sandwiched between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. We're told here that Pharaoh chooses 600 of his best chariots, and he sends them after the Israelites here into the Sinai wilderness. And it's at this point that I want us to focus our attention and think about this evening. This point, when the Israelites are between the Red Sea and the army of the Egyptian, the most powerful army known to man at this time. And it says that in Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 14, as Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. They became very frightened, as would anybody. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? I want us to think about for just a minute what the Israelites are saying here and what's going on. Again, they're sandwiched between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army with 600 chariots driving towards them. And they turn around and they say to Moses, hey, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Weren't there graves good enough in Egypt for us to be buried in? Because surely we've come all the way out into the wilderness here and we're going to die. Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, well, leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? You see, they'd rather be slaves than dead. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, do not fear, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Of course, we know the rest of that story, that Moses stands up, he stretches his hands out over the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts. The Israelites rather walk across on dry land, after which the Egyptian armies tried to pursue them, and the Egyptian armies are swallowed up by the Red Sea. But I want us to think for just a minute, for the rest of our time this evening, I want us to focus on that phrase that Moses says to the children of Israel. As they lose faith, as the Egyptians' army is bearing down upon them, and they, in that trying time, they have a moment of doubt, and they say, hey, couldn't we have just been buried in Egypt? That would have been just as good. Moses says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. What a strange phrase, to stand still and see. I want us to think about that phrase the rest of the time this evening together. And I want us to think about what Moses is saying there and what it truly means. You see, I want to suggest to you this evening that the true problem was not the Egyptian army for the Israelites. The problem was that they forgot that God was with them. This is the God who had just sent 10 plagues to Egypt. This is the God who had just brought the most powerful nation in the known world to its knees, set it in ruins, killed every one of the firstborn of that entire nation, and yet that nation's coming after them again. And as that nation bears down on them, again, they lose faith. See, what I'm trying to get to tonight, and that is that it's easy to forget that God's with us in trying times. Which of us is not guilty of that? In a moment of trial, in a moment of persecution, in a moment when things get tough, which of us this evening could raise our hands and say, I've never once lost faith, I've never once doubted that God could deliver me from this trial? Well, we all have. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, we see this same scenario play out with Elijah. In 1821, in 1 Kings 18 rather, Elijah here has got his famous showdown with the prophets of Baal. He calls the whole children of Israel together there on Mount Carmel, and he sets the prophets of Baal here, and he's here, and it's only him against all these prophets. They leap about and they cut themselves and they pray to Baal and they shout out to him to come down and consume their sacrifice, but nothing happens. Elijah rebuilds the altar, he gets up, he prays to God, and that altar is consumed with fire. Fire licks up the water that was poured around it, the sacrifices, the stone, the dust of the ground. Elijah calls the children of Israel together, and he stands up in their midst. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, it says, he came to the people and he said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. I want us to think about how much courage, how much conviction, how much zeal for the Lord that must have taken for this man to stand up in the midst of a nation who had lost faith, who was ready to persecute him, ready to put him to death, and say, hey, you got to make a choice. You're either going to follow God or you're going to follow Baal. And just a few short days later, just a little while later, in 1 Kings chapter 19, in verse 14, Elijah says to God, I have been very zealous for the Lord of hosts because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Think about the transformation that happened to this man in a short period of time to go from way up here, standing up, fighting for God, telling everybody, you got to make a choice, and just a little while later saying, I'm the only one left, God. Fleeing from everybody, going to the mountain of the Lord. He shelters in a cave, and there he says, I alone am left. You see, in trying times, it is so easy to forget that we're not alone. We're never alone. And perhaps that's why God continually reinforces that fact in His Word. In Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 8, it says, and the Lord, He is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear nor be dismayed. You're not alone. Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 10. We read this passage this morning. It's worth repeating though. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And And once again in Matthew chapter 28 in verses 19 through 20, as Jesus is giving His apostles the Great Commission, He tells them, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." We're never really alone. I want us to consider how God answers Elijah. Go back to what Elijah was saying in 1 Kings chapter 19, and let's listen to how God answers that thought, that I'm the only one, I am alone. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore into the mountain. It broke rocks into pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a small, still voice. So it was when Elijah heard it that he wrapped his face in his mantle. He went out and he stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and said, 'What are you doing, Elijah?'" Again, what an odd occurrence. What an odd situation Elijah here finds himself in. Have you ever thought, what's the significance of that? Why does God send a wind and then an earthquake and then a fire, but God doesn't show up in any of those natural disasters and any of those things? A wind strong enough to break pieces off the mountain, an earthquake that splits the rocks. But God's not there. Well, where's God? God is in the still, small voice. What's the significance of that? Well, we might not ever really know the significance, but I want to share with you my theory on the significance here tonight. You see, Elijah had just come from the top, being on fire for God, as zealous as he could be, the tippy top of faith. He'd come all the way from there. He has this showdown with the prophets of Baal. He tells the children of Israel, "Hey, kill those prophets." At the end, they take them and they kill them. But the very next thing that happens is Jezebel says, "I want to kill that guy." And she effectively puts a hit out on Elijah. You see what I think? I think it's just logical that Elijah thought in his mind that, hey, after this happens, things are going to change. This wicked ruling family that's in power, they're going to be deposed. They're going to be taken out of power, and things are going to just immediately change. And when that doesn't happen, Elijah is bewildered and afraid and confused. Hey, I've just done all these things for God, and yet I don't see any immediate results, no immediate gratification. So I think God is telling him here, again, this is a theory, but I think God is saying, Elijah, hey, you know what? If I wanted to, I could send a wind. I could send a mighty wind just out of the air. I could blow the palace off the top of the hill there in Jerusalem. I could blow Ahab and Jezebel away. If I wanted to, Elijah, I could split the earth open with an earthquake and swallow them up. If I wanted to, Elijah, I could rain fire down on heaven and burn them into ash. You see, but that wasn't God's plan. God wasn't in any of those things, none of those natural disasters, but God came to Elijah in a still and small voice. I want to suggest to you that's why that when the Egyptian army is bearing down on the Israelites, that God says, Moses says to the Israelites, stand still. Stand still and watch. Stand still and see, because the salvation of the Lord will come about. You see, because it's easy for us to get so busy that we just forget the big picture. We forget that God's with us. We forget that everything, that God is still working behind the scenes, no matter how trying, no matter how bad it gets in our lives, that if we hold fast to Him, He is still in control, no matter how bad the storm gets. Consider the parable of the soils. In Matthew chapter 13 and verses 20 and 22, here I want us to look at two specific types of soils and the explanation of those. Matthew 13, verses 20 through 22, it says, the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places. Well, this is the man who hears the word, immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. When affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. The one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, well, this is the man who hears the word. The worry of the world, the deceitfulness of wealth, choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. We can all sympathize and empathize with those two types of soil, right? If we're truthful with ourselves, if we aim that introspective mirror back around and look inside ourselves, then we've all seen elements of those soils in our own heart. We have all at times when persecution or affliction or trials arise, we've all at some points doubted that God's going to deliver us, doubted that God is going to see us through that. We've all gotten so busy before that we've forgotten to pray or forgotten to study, or maybe we're just too busy to come back to church again. At some point in our lives, we've all gotten too busy for God. You see, and that's why it's important to take time to slow down. Because God's timing is always perfect. The other day, a few weeks ago, I went on vacation. And when I came back off of vacation, the day after I came back, I got a text on the Remind message. And that Remind message popped up and dinged on my phone, and I immediately opened it up and I looked at the Remind message. And my phone kind of saves the last spot that you look at in a text. So when I looked at it, when I opened it up, this is what was showing. And I just read that very first line of that text, and the very first line says, Al was struck by lightning and caught fire yesterday. You know, obviously Al didn't get struck by lightning and caught fire yesterday, but that's what I read, and I'm thinking, man, I'm gone for 4 days, and look what happened to Al. You know, that's humorous, and we can laugh about that, and I'm glad you didn't get struck by lightning or caught fire, Al. But it illustrates a good point, and that is that it's important for us to slow down, to see the big picture, to see God working, to watch what God is doing in our lives. Sometimes we just got to slow down to see the whole message. We've got to eliminate those cares. We've got to find time to sit down, to pray, to block out the cares of this world, to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Because the only way that God ever works in our lives is God works in His own time. In Habakkuk chapter 2 and verses 2 through 3, it says, Then the Lord answered me, and He said, Record the vision and inscribe it on the tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. Let me read that again. The vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens towards the goal. It will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it. For it will certainly come, and it will not delay. God works in His own time. And I might add that God works in perfect timing. In Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, we see this same thought echoed once again in this story. Mordecai comes to Esther, and we all remember that. Esther's the queen. She's got to go into the king and expose a plot to kill all the Jews, and Mordecai comes to her and says, hey, I want you to do this. You need to go, you tell the king. She's understandably hesitant because it could mean her life. And Mordecai says this, For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have attained this place for such a time as this? God works in His own time. God puts things in our path. He puts us in places in perfect timing if we only stand still long enough to listen to His voice. Psalm chapter 130 and verse 5, I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait, and in His word do I hope. We sang a song the other night in our singing, in our monthly singing, called Teach Me, Lord, to Wait. Number 884 in our books. If you'd like to, you can turn over there. I'm going to read the words to us tonight, and I want us to think about them. Teach me, Lord, to wait down on my knees, till in your own good time you answer my pleas. Teach me not to rely on what others do, but to wait in prayer for an answer from you. Teach me, Lord, to wait while hearts are aflame. Let me humble my pride and call on your name. Keep my faith renewed and my eyes on Thee. Let me be on this earth what you want me to be. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Teach me, Lord, to wait. So finally, as we close our lesson this evening, I want us to think about the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey might say. In Exodus chapter 14, verses 21 through 23, that's where we find the rest of the story. As Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept back the sea by a strong east wind all night, and He turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them, one on the right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, his horsemen, they all went in after them into the midst of the sea. I hope it doesn't escape your attention this evening. That one very, very simple phrase there. The Lord swept back the sea by a strong east wind all night. All night. For an entire night, the Egyptians are on one side and the Israelites are on the other. For an entire night, the Israelites are camped with the most powerful army in the known world at their backs, and a parted sea before them. And in due time, in His own time, in God's perfect timing, God sends them across that sea on dry land. You see, in His time, God parted the obstacle that was before Him. In His time, He allowed the children of Israel to walk across on dry land. And in His time, He destroyed the most powerful army on the face of the earth. What I'm getting at, and what I want us to all understand this evening, is that if we stand still and we wait on God, if we listen to His voice, then He will part those obstacles before us. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31 says, Yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run. They will not get tired. They will walk. They will not become weary. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 7. This might seem like a verse that has nothing to do with our lesson tonight. It says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. I want to ask you this evening, who wouldn't want to be at peace with all their enemies? Who wouldn't want that kind of peace, to say, I have no enemies on this earth. Everybody who wants to do me good is completely at peace with me, and I'm at peace with them. I think all of us would want that, right? What is this verse telling us? What does this verse actually say? How does it fit into the lesson? It says, when a man's ways please the Lord, when a man's ways please the Lord, when you are pleasing to God, when you do follow His will, when you are striving to follow His example, to live by His word, then your enemies, even your enemies, will become your friends. God will cause your enemies to be at peace with you. He parts those obstacles before us. Whatever is in our path, whatever is preventing us from serving Him, He parts those things from before us if we follow Him, if we call ourselves children of His. Back at the first of the summer, I had the ability, my family and I, we all got to go to Marco Island, a little island off the coast of Florida, down south close to the Everglades. And there on Marco Island, there's all these swamps everywhere, mangrove swamps. And these mangrove swamps are these giant thickets of thick mangrove trees. They're just little scrubby trees, but they're impossible to get through. The only way to pass through these swamps is through these little bitty tunnels. They call them mangrove tunnels, where the trees have grown up over a little bitty waterway going through the middle of the swamp. Sam and I took a fan boat ride out through some of these mangrove tunnels in the Everglades. And as we're riding down that fan boat ride, zooming around these corners, everything looks the same. It's just trees as far as you can see. And I look and there's all these little bitty yellow leaves on the mangrove trees. There'd be this huge blossoming tree with all these green leaves, and about one out of every 10, 15, 20 leaves is yellow. I'm thinking, what's going on here? I asked our guide on the boat about it. Why are some of these leaves yellow? He says, well, those are the sacrificial leaves. He said, you see the mangrove tree, it grows in brackish water. That's water that's extremely salty. And like any plant, plants just don't like salt. But the mangrove tree has developed a very specific adaptation to grow in brackish water. Sends these roots down, and yeah, it takes up the salt. But about one out of every 15, 20 leaves or so will be a sacrificial leaf. That leaf will take in as much salt as it can possibly take, turn itself yellow, die, wither, and fall off. And when it sacrifices itself, it begins that cycle all over again. And it allows that tree to continue to bloom, continue to grow, and continue to live. And so continually, the mangrove tree grows through a continual process of one leaf dying so that the others can live, and one leaf dying so that the others can live. It occurred to me, while I'm sitting here listening to this guy talk about the sacrificial leaves of the mangrove tree, that's very much similar to what we read in Romans chapter 5 and in verse 6. In Romans chapter 5 and in verse 6, Paul writes to the Christians there at Rome, he says, for when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. In due time, Christ died for the ungodly. In other words, just at the right time, just at the right moment, at the specifically right time in world history, Jesus died for you and died for me. He sacrificed Himself, died on the cross, so that we could continue to bloom. We could continue to live. And we could grow as children of His. I want to ask you, why wouldn't we want to spread that message into the entire world? What an amazing thought that is. That God sent His Son, His only Son, sacrificed His Son on the cross for us so that we might have forgiveness of our sins and live with Him eternally in heaven. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, Christ died for you at the right time. This may be your right time. This may be your only time. We're not promised tomorrow. We are promised that one day this world will end. And when this world ends, we'll all be called home. Beyond that, we're also promised that one day our lives will end. and we'll be called home. So I ask you tonight, as we come to the close of our lesson, the close of this sermon, if you had to stand before God in judgment tonight, what would your answer be? Would you hear, enter in, good and faithful servant? Or would you hear, depart from me? If you have any doubts tonight that you would be welcomed into heaven, then heaven is too precious for you to leave this place tonight with those doubts in your mind. If you need to respond to the invitation to be buried with Him in baptism, then we are here for you at this time. If you need to respond and make your life right in a public way, then once again, we are here for you at this time. I want to go to heaven, and I want to see each and every one of you there. If you have need to respond to the invitation, then won't you come while together we stand and as we sing.